Good evening, one and all, and welcome. Today, we have a collection of 18 road trip stories to share with you. The first 6 stories you can find on my channel. And then, follow us over to Being Scared and We Shouldn't Be Here's channels to finish up with the remaining 12. The collection of stories are really freaky and well worth your time, so be sure to keep the chain going to listen to them all. But without further ado, I hope you're sitting comfortably, as it's time to start the car and let the darkness take control. It was summer, I believe the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I were in the middle of a cross-country road trip. We were driving through Texas, and for any of you who have driven across the entire state of Texas, you know that it is very long and very barren. There would be times when we would go for hours without seeing anything at all, and the towns we did pass didn't consist of much more than an old rusty gas station and a few dusty little houses. Looking out the window, you would swear that you were just driving through the same 5 miles of desert again and again. I had started getting a headache, and my husband suggested that I take a quick nap to get rid of it. I remember allowing myself to doze off as I watched the beautiful colours of a desert sunset. The slowing of the car woke me up at first, and I noticed how dark it was. I believe it was around 10 p.m. My husband had stopped at a gas station with a small shop. He told me he was going to grab us some food and asked me if I needed to pee. Knowing I might not have another chance for a while, I went to the shop to use the restroom. Both the men's and women's restroom were down a little hall from the open area of the shop. I was groggy, tired, and realized how badly I needed to pee, so I shuffled into the restroom. As I made my way the short distance from the door to the nearest of the 2 stalls, I made eye contact with a woman coming out of the other stall. She didn't quite look homeless, but she was definitely messy looking. She had wild grey hair, almost shoulder length, and it looked like she hadn't seen a brush in weeks. She was wearing ragged-looking clothing, a pair of ill-fitting black workout shorts, and I remember noting her foam flip-flops. Several layers on top, one of them being a large purple and green coat. Keep in mind that this is Texas in July. The jacket was hanging on her shoulders, crooked, as if she hadn't bothered to take a few more seconds to put it on correctly, and she was carrying something in a tied-up plastic grocery bag. I gave her a quick smile as our eyes met, and she just stared at me in return. Then her face turned wild and intense. Her eyebrows were set as if she were angry, but her eyes had a wild, alive look. She looked at me as though she were hungry, and this is when I first felt the tinge of something being wrong. I tried to brush it off. She waddled over to the only sink, and I took my time shutting the stall door, because something about her posture in front of the mirror struck me as odd, and I was trying to figure it out. She was standing with her body more angled towards me, but her face was turned to the mirror. Her body was tensed, legs slightly crouched, as if she was ready to act. Her hands were not up by her face, nor trying to fix her messed up hair, or even being washed. They were at her sides, elbows also slightly bent. I wasn't sure why, but I suddenly felt uncomfortable. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone behind. I shut and locked the stall door and took my time using the toilet. I wanted her gone before I left the safety of my cubicle, and I stayed there long after I had finished, but the woman was still there. I waited longer, and finally, I heard the smacking of her flip-flops as she made her way to the door. I heard it open, and then slam closed. The door was pretty heavy, and had slammed the same way when I had entered. I stayed for a moment, and allowed the wave of relief to wash over me, before reaching for the lock, and then I paused, fingers only an inch away from opening the door. I stayed as silent as I could, to manage to confirm if I had just heard something that I thought. It was indeed breathing. The woman had only pretended to leave. At this point I was scared and confused. Why had she tried to trick me into thinking that she'd only just left, to stick around and be as quiet as possible? I knew something was very wrong, so I stayed in the stall even longer, and this time I must have been at least 20 minutes. But I had no way of knowing for sure. I could tell from the direction of her breathing that she had positioned herself in the far corner, right next to the door, but far enough that I couldn't see her feet. Finally, I heard her leave. This time, I waited a few minutes to make sure that she hadn't just pulled another trick. I slipped out the store quickly, washed my hands, and rushed down the hallway to the store. It was pitch black outside, and I had no idea where she was. She couldn't be far. A large man was checking out at the register, so I waited near a window display until he left the store, and quietly slipped out the door behind him. Sure enough, crouched right outside the front door was the woman. She seemed surprised and she stood and turned away, walking quickly around the other side of the store. My husband was waiting in the car and asked me if I was alright, since I had taken much longer than usual, and I said that I would tell him all about it when we were far away from that store. I think she may have been a druggie and wanted to mug me, or that she worked with sex trafficking. I'm not really sure what. All that I know is that I hope our paths never cross again.
When I was younger, each summer and almost every New Year, my family would pack the car and go on a road trip to visit family in Mexico. We never had any problems until one particular trip when I was 8. Like every road trip before, we left our home in North Texas around 6 p.m. in order to reach our destination the next morning. So around 2 a.m., we crossed into Mexico, and that's when things got weird. When you're on the only stretch of freeway in the middle of the desert, you don't tend to freak out about having the same car behind you for miles. It was practically pitch black outside our car windows, the only visible shapes being the dotted stars and the eerie silhouettes of the cacti. We'd been in Mexico for about an hour and still had a few more to drive, and I remember sleeping but still being semi-conscious of what was around me because I didn't have the skill to really fall asleep in a car. So when my mother suddenly spoke my dad's name, I heard her. "Miguel, that car behind us. It's been behind us since we left Laredo." My dad peeked at the car. It shrugged off my mother's tension. "A lot of cars use this road. He's probably going to Reynosa or another city." And he left it at that. Despite his sureness, my mom kept a wary eye on the car behind us. By this time, my siblings and I were hyper aware of the car and entertained ourselves with watching the car through the gaps in the luggage that blocked the rear window. We got tired pretty quick. "He's getting closer," my mother noted, and we turned to watch as the car inched closer and closer to ours. "He's too close, Miguel." And she was right. By this time, The car was practically pressed against the rear of our car, and on a lonely stretch of highway in the middle of nowhere with another few hours until daylight. It was downright scary. We couldn't do much. My dad didn't slow down, and he didn't speed away either. He just drove, and the car followed. The next 30 minutes were the most tense we had ever experienced. The car would ease off sometimes, only to press its blinding headlights against our rear once more, like he knew he was freaking us out and enjoying it. It was during one of the periods that the car had pulled away that my mom spotted a police car up ahead, parked on the side of the road, and she didn't miss a beat. "Pull over right now, Miguel." And he did, and the car kept driving. I wonder how confused the policeman must have been as he watched my dad park our car right in front of him. The policeman came over and asked what was wrong, and my mother urgently told him everything. The car, the way it followed us, and taunted us. The policeman took her claims seriously and told us of how people were victimized and had their cars stolen on these empty highways by thugs and criminals. And then he offered to drive behind us for a while to make us feel safe. We drove off with the police cruiser behind us, relieved, until about 10 minutes later, when we saw something that confirmed the policeman's words and my mother's worst fears. 10 minutes later, we saw the car pulled over on the side of the road, waiting.
In 2014, I was driving at night on Highway 81 in southwest Oklahoma. It was around 2 a.m., and I hadn't seen another car for at least 30 minutes. I was on a stretch of road between Chickasha and Rush Springs. In other words, I was in the middle of nowhere. I come over a small rise and see a car upside down in a ditch and a body laying just out of the car. Kind of looked like he was sleeping on his side. I slam on the brakes and get out of the car and run over to the guy. I touch his shoulder, and he kind of slumped over onto his back. It was then I could see his head was smashed flat on the left side, and his abdomen was open. I could smell whiskey coming out of his gut. It was horrifying. This man had no pulse. So I get on my phone and I call 911. I give them an estimate of where I am. They tell me the nearest help is 25 minutes away, and I needed to wait with the wreck until they got there. I hang up the phone and look around. I'm alone in Oklahoma. The only companion I had was a dead man. Not knowing what to really do, I took his hand and said the Lord's Prayer, then covered his face with a shirt that was hanging out of the car. I was seriously shaking a bit. It was then I heard the coyotes start tuning up. If you haven't heard this sound, it's like the sound of small children being hurt badly. They wail and screech in what I think is a big circle around me and this man. It's been 15 minutes and no other cars have shown up. I hear them on the highway. They are crossing just out of the headlights of my car. Now I have a decision. Do I get in my car and let them come up and tear on this guy? Or do I find something to swing and protect his body? I got the tire iron out of my trunk and go back over to where he is laying. I guess I'm making a stand. I wait another 5 minutes. I hear them running around. It's really dark. I realize I'm not truly in control of this situation. Something very primal comes over my brain. It's like rage, along with a heavy dose of fear. Whatever was going to happen, I was going to fight like a crazed ape on the savannah. At this very moment, I see car lights. Finally, a car shows up, and wouldn't you know it, it's a Pontiac Grand Am full of methed up country boys. They pull over and look at me, then see the dead man, then the car. I say, "Guys, that guy is dead, and there are coyotes circling me. They go to their car and pull out several handguns and a couple of flashlights. They are wired for sound and excited as fuck to kill the shit out of these things, although they were almost as unnerving as the wild animals out in the dark. A couple of minutes pass and we hear a siren off in the distance. The guys say, "It's the cops." They jump in their car and haul ass. I'm alone again. Me and this poor man. 60 seconds later, a state trooper shows up, then 2 deputy sheriffs, and finally 3 city cops from some small town called Ninica, and finally an ambulance. They look the guy over and pronounce him dead. Then they ask me at least 100 questions, finally asking if they can search my car for drugs. They search and find nothing, then tell me, "Thanks for staying with the wreck. You can go." I left and started driving down this pitch dark road yet again. I feel like I've been in a battle for my life, and thinking our civilized behavior is little more than a thin veneer over a wild animal that wants to survive.
When I was younger, me and my family went on a road trip to Wyoming to see Yellowstone National Park. It's a beautiful place if you haven't seen it yet. I'd recommend it. Anyway, so from our home in California, it was about a 17-hour drive in our Yukon XL, the largest, most comfortable road trip SUV you can imagine. It took us several days worth of on and off driving to get there, and during the nights, we would try to find a little motel to rest at. One of the nights, due to us being behind schedule, my dad attempted to drive through the night to get us there sooner. He made it probably in the wee hours of the night before he deemed it safe to park us in this little unlit rest stop in the middle of the woods, in some flyover state. Me and my brothers had fallen asleep in the car several hours before he'd stopped. So for at least a couple of hours, we were all asleep in the car, in this dark little parking lot, surrounded by forest. Having got a good couple of hours sleep, and being in a pretty comfortable position, I woke up in the middle of the night, quite disoriented and not really scared. I looked around, and see everyone fast asleep in this pitch black car. And naturally, I felt alone. I tried to fall back asleep, but it's just not working out. And so, I sit there for a while, boredom settling in, looking out the window to see where we are. It's pitch black, and I couldn't see jack shit, and get the overwhelming feeling that we shouldn't be here. Luckily, I wasn't the type to pack light, and I had brought a couple of flashlights in my bag. Being careful not to disturb my sleeping family, I reached into the back seat, unzipped my bag, and pulled out a little plastic yellow flashlight. It wasn't the brightest, but it was enough to see the foreground of general surroundings. I put it up to the glass, making sure not to make any noise, and pushed the little switch into the on position. I pressed my face against the glass and looked out. At first, it looked like a normal tree line with some bushes. Whatever. But as I scanned the darkness, looking for animals and buildings, I noticed this dark shape standing between the 2 trees in the distance. It looked like the shape of a man, but it was not moving, just sitting there. And after watching it for a good while and seeing no real signs of movement, I just assumed it was a bush of some kind or natural occurrence. Just as I was about to turn the light off and reattempt sleep, I saw the shadow shape turn 90 degrees and move behind a tree, disappearing from sight. This scared the shit out of me, and I immediately turned off the flashlight and threw my sweater turned blanket over my head, shutting my eyes tightly and covering my ears. I was paralyzed with fear. too full of adrenaline to get any sleep. Just sat in this semi-fetal position being scared, clutching my flashlight for the rest of the night. I waited until the sun came up, and we were back on the road before I managed to get any sleep. I never told anyone about the man I saw in the woods.
This happened to me about 2 years ago when I was on a cross-country road trip with my good friend Kim. We started in the Northwest, and our final destination was in Georgia. We were trying to make this trip as quickly as possible, and since it was just the two of us, we took shifts, sleeping and driving. We had just passed through Laramie, Wyoming, where I got pulled over for speeding. Not much, only 10 miles over the speed limit. I apologized to the police officer, and he kindly let us off the hook since our car had no cruise control and we had a long way to go ahead. After leaving Laramie, we didn't stop for a long time, and the highway rarely cut through any towns. It was probably 3 or 4 in the morning, and the highway was deserted. Tall pines lined the 2-lane blacktop, and jagged mountains framed the starlit sky above. Kim was sleeping heavily, her chair reclined all the way down, a blanket thrown over her head. I had the radio on, but she was so exhausted she paid no attention to it. I was trying to concentrate on the road and the quiet music on the radio to stay awake. Visibility was very limited, and there were no lights on this road. Suddenly, red and blue lights flashed in my rearview mirror. I hastily looked at my speedometer, but I was diligently following the speed limit after the narrow escape from getting a ticket earlier. I pulled over, killed my engine, and rolled down my window. The cop car behind me appeared to be an unmarked vehicle, but it was hard to tell. Kim didn't stir as the police officer approached my window.
"Ma'am,"
he said in a Midwestern drawl,
"you know why I pulled you over today?"
"No, officer, I don't." His flashlight was pointed directly at my face, and I had to avert my eyes. I looked at the badge on his chest instead of his face.
"Your plates sure are from far away. Where are you headed?"
The police officer in Laramie had asked the same thing. "Georgia. Family emergency."
"Is that so? Well, miss, you aren't in any shape to make it to Georgia from Nebraska. No siree."
I frowned. Was my car breaking down? Tail lights out? In my tired haze, had I missed something vital? "I'm sorry, what's wrong?"
"Here, miss, step out of the car. I can show you."
He gestured with his flashlight, and the beam slanted across Kim's blanket-shrouded face. She yawned. "What's going on?" The police officer abruptly turned, walked away, and got into his car. He flipped a U-turn and sped off in the opposite direction down the highway. Kim and I stared at each other for a moment before I started the car, rolled up the window, and sped off, with no regard for the speed limit this time.
A few years ago, I was hitchhiking to Vienna. With me was a friend. She was quite young at the time, in her teens. I was 22 or so. Anyway, we were kind of stuck on this gas station on the Austrian highway. A guy with long dreadlocks and punk attire, and a young girl who also looked like fresh out of the stoner punk catalog. Not the best combination if you are in need of a ride. Anyway, we see this bunch of shabby-looking guys in their 3 cars, and I flat out ask them if they'll give us a ride. It was fucking cold, and we were kinda late, so you take what you can get. At least I thought so. At first, these guys were against taking us, but as soon as I started to speak in Serbian, the good old, "Are you go, brother? Come with us," bullshit kicked in, and they let us step into their car. After a few kilometers, the driver and his friend start to openly talk about which car we gonna get tonight, Toyota or Mercedes. I took a closer look at them, and it was those kind of guys who had women's names tattooed all over their arms and shit. Obviously, they drove to Vienna to steal cars. Well, I didn't think much about it, rather than laughing to myself in what absurd situations my life always leads me in. But suddenly, the younger guy turns to me and asks me, "Hey, how much do you want for her?" in Serbian. I'm like, "Dude, what?" And he explains to me in detail how he would fuck her all night and day, and offered me €300 if we drive to the next gas station now and I can have her. Of course I said there's no chance, but thinking that these guys are gangsters, I was terrified. But the guy kept insisting. Then, suddenly, my friend asks me aloud in German what the fuck we're talking about. "Come on, man, translate it for me. You know, I kinda like it when men talk Yugo. Makes me a bit horny." At this point, I prayed to all gods in the world that the two gangsters couldn't understand German. They couldn't, and the next thing I did is that I turned to my friend and told her that if she won't shut up, I'm gonna make her shut up. She, also, was terrified, and I felt so fucking sorry for her. The next hour or so, I made up all kinds of stories, from "she's my girlfriend" to actual marriage, because the one guy didn't give up, of course. And then the driver said something like, "Give it up. You know these Austrian women aren't as passionate than our Balkan girls." And we drove in silence. As they kicked us out in Vienna, my friend of course immediately yelled at me, kicked me and whatnot. I told her that these guys just wanted to rape her, and it was the only way I could think about how to react. I thought that telling her what was going on during the drive would put us all in danger much more, because having two terrified young people sitting next to two gangsters is worse than one person being terrified, or so. I don't know. In the end, I apologized 1,000 times, explaining the whole situation, and she thanked me. Definitely one of the weirder stories of my life.
Greetings. You may recognize my voice. This is Being Scared. Now that the lights are off, the doors are unlocked, and the darkness has taken control, head over to my channel to watch part 2 of this 3-part collaboration. The road trip horror has only just begun.